Historical Marathon. The best episodes of Naval Legends for those who haven't seen them and those who are keen to re-watch them. At the end of Marathon, we'll publish a brand new episode about Greek cruiser Georgios Averof. Look for special codes in each and every episode of our History Marathon. As with our in-game daily shipments, all the gifts will be revealed in advance. If you're hungry for more, you'll have a chance to double the haul of gifts through your actions. If we manage to reach a set number of new subscribers within a 24-hour period, we'll double the number of gifts for the code. You can find more information on our website. Don't forget to subscribe, as there are more bonus codes to come.
Pensacola's association with naval aviation dates back to 1914 and the creation of the country's first naval air station. And in this episode of Naval Legends, we'll be tracing over the development of the air arm of the US Navy.
In 1910, one of the aviation pioneers, Glenn Curtiss, supported by US Navy, prepared an ambitious experiment. It included cruiser USS Birmingham and an aircraft constructed by Curtiss and piloted by Eugene Ely, a test pilot.
As he strapped himself into his Curtiss Hudson Flyer aboard the light cruiser USS Birmingham on the 14th of November 1910, Eugene Ely, then 24 years of age, could hardly have known that he was partaking in the birth of one of the most powerful weapon systems of the 20th century. Only a few minutes later, he'd make history as the first man to ever launch an aircraft from the deck of a ship.
2 months later, in January 1911, Curtiss, Ely, and US Navy carried out another demonstration in the San Francisco Bay, where cruiser USS Pennsylvania with a flight deck on her was moored.
Ely flew from the Presidio, which is an Army fort in San Francisco, about 15 miles down the bay, and landed on the flight deck, which had been equipped with about 20 manila ropes with sea bags at the end of the ropes. The airplane had a grappling hook underneath it, and when he touched down on the flight deck, the grappling hook caught 5 of the wires. He stopped in about 30 feet, and that was the first landing of an aircraft on a ship at sea.
Aircraft specifications for Curtiss Pusher, Model D4. Length, almost 8 meters. Wingspan, more than 10 meters. Takeoff weight, 590 kilograms. Engine, Curtiss. Power, 40 HP. Maximum speed, 80 kilometers per hour. Crew, 1 person. Despite the obvious success of Curtiss's experiments, the idea of specialized aircraft carrying ships did not come to fruition for a very long time in the USA. The High Command of the US Navy treated airplanes as auxiliary equipment of a warship. Admirals believed that aircraft could not become a fully fledged strike force for the fleet. They were restricted to reconnaissance and artillery spotting missions, and they were mostly seaplanes. World War I spurred the progress of the US naval aviation to some extent, but it was aimed mostly at the increase in number of seaplanes.
When we entered World War I in April 1917, we had no carriers at this time yet, but we had many flying boats. And when the World War I ended in November 1918, we had over 200 twin-engine Curtiss flying boats flying combat. So the first submarine ever sunk by a aircraft was sunk by a Curtiss H-16 flying boat in 1918.
During World War I, aircraft began to change shape and form. Gone were the fragile-looking open trusses with webs of bracing wire. Replacing them came more modern biplanes with continuous skin covering on a fuselage, more powerful engines, and more powerful armament. Case in point, this VE-7 Bluebird. VE-7 was to become the US Navy's first carrier-launched fighter.
Aircraft specifications for VE-7 Bluebird. Length 7.5 meters, wingspan 10.5 meters, takeoff weight 879 kilograms, engine Wright Hispano E3, power 180 HP, maximum speed 171 kilometers per hour, service ceiling 4,500 meters, armament 1 or 2 machine guns, caliber 7.62 millimeter, crew 1 person. At the end of World War I, when the British built their first true aircraft carrier with a flight deck stretching from aft to bow, everyone understood that planes would be an integral part of future naval fleets. That's why in 1920, the US Navy refitted its old collier, USS Jupiter, removed a part of its superstructure and constructed a 160-meter-long flight deck on her. Renamed USS Langley, the ship was commissioned in 1922 and became the first aircraft carrier of the US Navy. Initially, Langley served as an experimental platform where the basis for battle application of deck aircraft was laid down and a new school of shipbuilding was created.
Taking off was not an issue. We didn't use a catapult in those days. The planes were able to take off on the flight deck, but the landing was the issue. So initially, not only did they have the arresting wires that go across the flight deck like you see on modern carriers, they also had cables that ran perpendicular with the flight deck, in other words, fore and aft. They had a hook, a tail hook, and you also had what looked like an anchor, or several anchors, little small anchors on a rod between the main wheels, and they hooked into the fore and aft wires. So it's kind of a spider web nightmare. After about a year, we realized that we did not need the fore and aft wires, so we just went with the cross deck wires, and it worked out fine.
In the autumn of 1920, the Deputy Commander of the US Air Force, Brigadier General Mitchell, declared that aviation can destroy, disable, and sink any existing warship, as well as any other built in future. Next year, in the summer, tests were conducted. They showed that aircraft is quite capable of sinking even a battleship by dropping a sufficient number of powerful bombs on it. The results of these tests led the Navy to the conclusion that their ships needed reinforced anti-aircraft defenses and thicker horizontal armor. Advocates of naval aviation were already imagining squadrons of deck aircraft sinking enemy ships. All they needed was to modernize airplanes and develop a bomb-dropping technique.
In the mid-1920s, Curtiss presented to the Navy their design for a land-based fighter, the F-6C. It had a powerful engine and had great maneuverability and speed, as befitted Curtiss's legacy for making maneuverable sports aircraft and breaking speed records. It even came with an auxiliary fuel tank as an option. The aircraft was famous for being one of the first to try dive bombing as a technique. And the aircraft entered service, particularly taking part in Lexington's commissioning ceremony as part of her air wing.
Aircraft specifications for F-6C Hawk. Length almost 7 meters. Wingspan 11.5 meters. Takeoff weight 1,238 kilograms. Engine Pratt & Whitney R13403 Wasp. Power 410 HP. Maximum speed 255 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 7,000 meters. Armament 2 Browning machine guns, caliber 7.62 millimeter. 2 bombs weighing 52.6 kilograms. Crew 1 person.
The F-6C had its biggest problem was that it had a water jacket around it. It was built kind of like a car. The engine was called an inline engine. It was a better looking airplane, but when warplanes get shot at and a water jacket around, just like on your car, you put one bullet in that water jacket, the water's going to go out and the plane is going to stop. So it was not a successful airplane. F-7C that followed it was they used the what they call jugs, separate individual cylinders.
So the advantages to that for the Navy, as opposed to a liquid-cooled engine, was that you eliminated the entire cooling system, which involved a radiator, water lines, some sort of cooling scoop or vent or something for the radiator, and you also eliminated a massive amount of maintenance After the F-7C in the late 20s, every Navy operational fighter, reciprocating fighter had a radial engine that operated off a carrier. Everyone knows, associates Boeing with airliners, but Boeing was, back in the 20s, was a very big supplier of fighters to the Navy. They had one particular line of fighters, the F-4B fighters, which the last version came out in 1932, the F-4B-4.
Aircraft specifications for F-4B. Length 6.2 meters. Wingspan more than 9 meters. Takeoff weight 1,323 kilograms. Engine Pratt & Whitney R1340E Wasp. Power 550 HP. Maximum speed 301 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 8,400 meters. Armament 2 Browning machine guns, caliber 7.62 millimeter. In the bomber variant, the aircraft could carry up to 227 kilograms of bombs. Crew 1 person.
Especially in the 20s, when their aviation advancements were happening at a very high rate. Aerodynamics, engines, airframes. There was a lot of competition amongst the manufacturers because people were making better airplanes every year. So someone would turn out a very good fighter. A year later, somebody would turn out an even better fighter.
In the early 1930s, the Bureau of Aeronautics, the organization responsible for the development and acquisition of naval aircraft and its associated materiel, allegedly asked Grumman to design a retractable gear system for the Boeing F-4B-4. Well, Grumman's engineers had patented their design and weren't inclined to share it with somebody else. Besides, they said, you couldn't actually fit a retractable system to the Boeing aircraft. Only a month later, however, they developed and presented to the Navy a new 2-seat fighter aircraft. Coincidentally, the Navy had only recently issued a requirement for a new series of fighter aircraft. The Grumman FF-1, sometimes known as the Goblin, met all these requirements. The FF-1 was revolutionary: a duralumin skin, enclosed cockpit, and of course, retractable gear. In 1933, 25 of these aircraft formed the air group for the carrier Lexington.
Aircraft specifications for FF-1 Goblin. Length 7.5 meters. Wingspan 10.5 meters. Takeoff weight 2,111 kilograms. Engine Wright R182078. Power 700 HP. Maximum speed 323 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 6,700 meters. Armament 3 Browning machine guns, caliber 7.62 millimeter. 2 bombs weighing 52.6 kilograms. Crew 2 persons.
This is the only one in the world, the one that we have. We found it in a junkyard down in Nicaragua. As a matter of fact, Navy pilot found it down there. It's crop dusting down there several decades back now. And he called the Navy, or he called the Grumman people, and they said, we'll be right down. 8 years later, it came up here to the museum. They flew it into the museum. One of the few that's been flown into the museum. Most of these airplanes come in pieces and we put them together here.
The Great Depression of 1929 ruined many enterprises and almost destroyed the Curtiss Company, which had been supplying the Army and the Navy with cutting-edge aircraft throughout the course of the 1920s. However, Curtiss survived, and in 1933 followed Grumman in constructing an airplane with retractable chassis and duralumin skin. The Navy planned to put the new Curtiss aircraft into service aboard a freshly built carrier that was launched the same year. However, its fighter wing had been already completed, and the command decided to repurpose the new Curtiss plane as a bomber with the BF-2C-1 designation, Curtiss's engineers networked their design according to its new specialization and installed additional gear for bomb suspension.
It was one of the early dive bombers again. They started trying to dive bomb by just putting a bomb on the fuselage. A bomb has better aerodynamics than an airplane, so the bomb would accelerate. When you're going into this 60, 70, 80 degrees nose down, the bomb would accelerate and go into the propeller. And what they did was they had this trapeze-like outfit, undercarriage that would swing out and allow the bomb to clear the propeller.
In the 1930s, the biplane began to give way to the monoplane, and the US Navy did not feel like being left behind in these advancements. It was at this point that Grumman presented to the Navy their new fighter designed for a monoplane, the F-4F3. Now, the Navy already had the Buffalo, but the Grumman design intrigued them. Firstly, it was very fast. The prototype in trials hit a speed of 287 knots. It was highly maneuverable. It had a powerful armament of 4 caliber 50 Browning machine guns, and the pilot sat high. The nose had an 8-degree downward slope, which meant that the pilot could then keep visual contact with the target even at high angles of lead. After a number of modifications to the prototype, the Navy ordered it into series production.
Aircraft specifications for F-4F3 Wildcat. Length, almost 9 meters. Wingspan, 11.5 meters. Takeoff weight, 3,367 kilogram. Engine, Pratt & Whitney R183076. Power, 1,200 HP. Maximum speed, 533 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling, 9,950 meters. Armament, 4 Browning machine guns, caliber 12.7 millimeter. The aircraft could carry 2 50-kilogram bombs. Crew, 1 person. The design was so successful that both the British and French became interested in the aircraft. As a result, the Wildcat was put into service by the Royal Navy earlier than in the US Navy.
Now, one of the rather obsolete features of the Wildcat was it did have retracting landing gear. That was the good news, but the bad news was the pilot had to crank the gear up by hand. So when you launched off the carrier, you spent the first minute airborne cranking the landing gear up. So that kind of, you couldn't form up or do much anything but get the gear up, so that was a little hard to deal with. But of course the advantage to that was there was no hydraulic system to shoot out. So by cranking the gear up, you eliminated the system.
By the end of the 1930s, the US deck aviation had grown quite big muscles. The Navy had 7 aircraft carriers in active service, and several more were being constructed. Airplane designers supplied the American fleet with the updated modern aircraft almost every year. In the 1920s and 30s, the US Navy carried out a number of exercises which demonstrated an enormous potential of strike air groups. In 1938, squadrons from the carrier USS Saratoga conducted a successful training attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor. But considering that the American fleet was stationed in California at that time, the results of this operation didn't draw too much attention. Nothing interesting, just another exercise.
Averof was the most modern ship of the Greek Navy, and even among the navies of all the opposing countries, the reasons why she became the Greek flagship are clear.
As was common with a lot of fleets at the time, the relationship between officers and enlisted was not always idyllic. The cup of patience overflowed, however, when for lunch the crew were served this.
but Naval Headquarters ordered Averof to be scuttled on the premise that she was too old to be of military value, and there seemed little merit in giving the enemy a prize of the hero of the Balkan Wars. Averof survived 5 wars and was originally funded by donations from private Greek citizens, and 70 years later was again rebuilt by donations from the public. Welcome to Athens.
On December the 7th, 1941, the United States entered World War II. And it was on that day the numerous critics of aircraft carrier tactics within US Navy Command realized the degree of their error. Together with the line warships of the Pacific Fleet, the flames of Pearl Harbor burnt down the very doctrine of absolute domination of heavy artillery ships in naval war. In an instant, all books on the art of naval warfare became obsolete, and there was no time to write new ones. The enemy had to be repelled, and they had to be struck with their own weapon.
On December 7th, the Navy had 3 carriers in the Pacific Ocean. We only had 3 carriers there. We only had a total of 7 carriers. Japan had 14 carriers. So the first thing we needed was more carriers, but the problem with that is that it takes 2 years to build a carrier.
The second problem was that the main fighter aircraft of the US Navy, the F-4F Wildcat, was inferior to the Japanese Zero in all respects.
The Mitsubishi A6M Zeke, commonly known as the Zero. This was arguably the premier fighter in the Pacific theater until about 1943. It had a number of advantages. Firstly, it's lightweight. It had an aluminium-magnesium alloy frame, and this meant it was highly maneuverable. Had excellent firepower. It had both cannon and machine gun. Had excellent vision from its high-mounted canopy. The only drawback was it was a tad fragile, but first you had to hit it.
Zero was much faster. It could out-climb, out-dive, and out-turn a Wildcat. How did we use this old airplane and manage to make it work so well? The first thing I already mentioned, it was very, very rugged, very difficult to shoot down. The fuel tank had a self-sealing bladder in it, so when a bullet went through it, it sealed itself up. You didn't lose your gas, which was important when you're 100 miles, 150 kilometers from your carrier. The pilot sat in an armored tub, basically, like a bathtub. He had steel plate all around him. So the plane was very survivable. The other thing you had to do, if you're a Wildcat pilot, you had to do formation flying. You had to be with another Wildcat to protect each other. So if one Wildcat got jumped, he could maneuver and try to pull the Zero in front of the other Wildcat.
3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, American carrier aviation achieved its first victory. The author of this victory flew the SPD Dauntless.
Dauntless was responsible for the first kill by US Naval Aviation on an enemy combatant. The Dauntless was flown by Lieutenant Dickinson, who was assigned to the Enterprise Air Group, and he had survived being jumped at Pearl Harbor with the loss of his rear seater. On December the 10th, it sighted the Japanese submarine I-70 and attacked and sank her. Features of the aircraft related to the wing include the very large and visible dive brakes required for its role. Less visible is the fact that the wing has no internal spars. Now this makes it lighter, but a significant drawback is the fact that you cannot fold this aircraft's wing. Despite this, Dauntless entered service with the US Navy's fleet.
Aircraft specifications for the SPD Dauntless. Length 10 meters. Wingspan 12.6 meters. Maximum takeoff weight 4,587 kilograms. Engine, R1820-32. Power, 950 HP. Maximum speed, 405 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling, 7,680 meters. Armament, two 12.7mm Browning M2 machine guns and two 7.62mm machine guns in rear. Bomb payload, 725 kilograms. Crew, 2 persons.
So the Dauntless was designed expressly for one thing and one thing only, and that was sinking ships. And it was very good at what it did. The Battle of Midway was probably the definitive battle where everyone knew that air power was going to be the only way you were going to win the Pacific. So at the Battle of Midway, which we're probably all familiar with, 3 U.S. Navy carriers, the Enterprise, the Yorktown, and the Hornet, up against 4 Japanese carriers. The Japanese had a huge force with them, including several large battleships. They had over 100 fighting ships, and then they had an invasion force. The Navy had 3 carriers and about 20 other ships, not one battleship, because they'd all been damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor.
Early in the morning of June the 4th, about 45 Dauntlesses attacked the Japanese task force. The lightning-fast strike of the American dive bombers ended in a sweeping victory. In just a few hours, the Dauntlesses destroyed almost half the carriers of the Japanese Imperial Navy, thus turning the tide of the Pacific War. This battle was also notable because it was here that the Avenger torpedo bomber made its debut.
Grumman Avenger was the largest aircraft that we operated off carriers in World War II. It replaced the Douglas Devastator torpedo bomber, which was obsolete in 1941.
Aircraft specifications for the TBM Avenger. Length 12.5 meters. Wingspan 16.5 meters. Takeoff weight 7,876 kilograms. Engine Wright R26008. Power 1,700 HP. Maximum speed 415 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 7,193 meters. Armament 3 12.7mm machine guns and 1 7.62mm machine gun under the fuselage. 8 127mm HVAR rockets. The aircraft could carry up to 907 kilograms of bombs or 1 Mark 13 torpedo. Crew 3 persons.
Early on, they could do torpedo runs, or they could be used as a dive bomber. So if you were attacking an airfield, the Avengers could be dive bombers. They could come back to the carrier, and if somebody saw Japanese ships were sighted, they could load them with torpedoes and go out on a torpedo run.
By the end of 1942, the Avengers had distinguished themselves by sinking Japanese carrier Ryujo during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and battleship Hiei in the first battles for Guadalcanal. However, the finest hour of these torpedo bombers was yet to come, when in 1942, the Avengers joined the Dauntlesses and Wildcats, which had borne the weight of the initial phase of the air war against Japan. Meanwhile, US industry prepared replacements for the battle-battered aircraft fleet.
The F-6F Hellcat, known as the Ace Maker, arguably the most significant carrier-borne aircraft of World War II, and was responsible for some 75% of the Navy's kills. 12,274 were built by Grumman, 1 an hour every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was simple, it was reliable, it was rugged. It had claimed 5,157 enemy kills for a loss of only 270. Another nickname it earned was the aluminum tank, and it earned for the manufacturer the moniker Grumman Iron Works. Indeed, some pilots spoke of returning home with battle damage so significant that more air was passing through the aircraft than around it.
Aircraft specifications for F-6F Hellcat. Length more than 10 meters. Wingspan 13 meters. Takeoff weight 6,754 kilograms. Engine Pratt & Whitney R2800 10W double wasp. Power 2,135 HP. Maximum speed 629 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 11,278 meters. Armament 6 12.7mm Colt Browning M2 machine guns. 6 127mm HVAR rockets. Bomb payload up to 907 kilograms. Crew 1 person.
When it was all said and done at the end of the war, the Hellcat had a 19-to-1 kill ratio, which meant for every Hellcat shot down air-to-air, Hellcat shot down 19 Japanese aircraft, which at that point in the war, many of them were fighters.
In 1943, the US Pacific Fleet began to put heavy strike aircraft carriers from the Essex class into service, each of which could carry up to 100 planes on board. The war had reached a stage where the success of combat operations was defined by the economic power of the warring parties.
So it was a huge advantage that we had that the Japanese did not have. They did not have anywhere near the capability to match us in production. So by mid-44, pretty much everywhere we went, we had a huge carrier force to back up whatever was happening.
In 1943, Grumman, the main manufacturer of fighters for the US Navy, had to make room for another company. New aircraft carriers boasted 4FU Corsairs produced by Vought on their flight decks. However, this machine did not become a competitor for Grumman's Hellcats. The Corsair had other purposes.
Corsair's introduction into service hit some snags with carrier qualifications. It exhibited some really nasty low-speed stall characteristics, the landing gear wasn't suitable, and it also had such a powerful engine that the torque caused roll as well as yaw due to P-factor. Finally, the long nose meant that on final approach you couldn't actually see the carrier you were trying to land on, although the solution for that was a long curve which kept your eyes on the target. As a result, Corsair entered service as a land-based aircraft with the Marines in early '43.
Aircraft specifications for the F4U Corsair. Length, more than 10 meters. Wingspan, 12.5 meters. Takeoff weight, 6,654 kilograms. Engine, Pratt & Whitney R2800 18W. Power, 2,380 HP. Maximum speed, 718 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling, 12,802 meters. Armament, 6 12.7mm Colt Browning M2 machine guns. 8 127mm HVAR rockets. Bomb payload up to 907 kilograms. Crew 1 person.
Marines used it heavily. It was more of a Marine aircraft in World War II. The Navy primarily flew the Hellcat. Corsair first flew in 1940. It was extremely advanced for its day. It was the first U.S. Navy fighter that could go 400 miles an hour straight and level. It has a very odd wing arrangement. It's got a gull wing, and the reason for that is because of the size of the propeller. If you had a regular wing, the landing gear would be so long that you'd have to have a huge wing for the landing gear to fold up into, so the Vought engineers came up with that very unusual design.
In 1943, on the basis that the war was going to continue a while longer, work was started on the development of a successor to the F6F Hellcat. The result was known as the engine with a saddle on it. It was the F8F Bearcat. An interesting design feature at the time was the addition of exploding wingtips. The idea was that if the maneuvers were so hard that there was risk of a complete structural failure of the wing, The outer meter or so of each wing would detach. Never really worked in practice though. Either one tip would detach and not the other, or it just simply at different times. The solution was to add explosive charges. However, it never worked according to plan, and indeed an accident with an explosion killed a Navy technician. So production aircraft soon had that idea removed.
Aircraft specifications for the F-8F Bearcat. Length almost 8.5 meters. Wingspan almost 11 meters. Takeoff weight 6,105 kilograms. Engine Pratt & Whitney R280030W. Double Wasp. Power 2,250 HP. Maximum speed 737 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling 11,247 meters. Armament 4 20mm cannons. 4 127mm HVAR rockets. Bomb payload up to 1,700 kilograms. Crew 1 person. By the time the F-8F Bearcat was mass-produced, the Hellcats and Corsairs were already dominating the skies over the Pacific Ocean, while the Helldivers and Avengers were finishing off the remnants of the Japanese Navy. In October 1944, the Americans sank 27 Japanese ships in the Leyte Gulf, including 4 aircraft carriers and 3 battleships. The following year, in April, 227 planes from 9 American carriers destroyed the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the mighty Yamato. When U.S. troops began landing at Okinawa, aircraft carrier USS Midway was launched back home in the USA. She would become a symbol of the American Navy's power for many years to come.
In the early 1940s, the Bureau of Aeronautics learned about the developments of jet engine technology in England and Germany and asked Westinghouse and Alice Chalmers to make American versions. The initial responses, though, were not positive. These early jets had low power at low speed, they were unreliable, and they had high fuel consumption. Add to that the requirements for swept wings, which seemed necessary for maneuverability, and it became unsuitable for carrier use. After the war, though, with the development of the threat from the Soviet Union and their jet program, it became obvious that the Navy could no longer avoid the technology. In 1947, the FH-1 Phantom entered fleet service, and with that, the age of naval aviation jets began.